You have no doubt seen news headlines and other videos about the Great Resignation, accompanied by equally alarmist statistics like 40% of people are about to quit their job, and April alone saw over 4 million people hand in their resignation. But before you read too much into it, or worse yet, base major career decisions off of it, you should know the full story. So, is this a serious event in the landscape of employer-employee relationships? Well, those of you who watch the channel regularly will know that I hate dragging out an answer, so no. Not really. Not to a vast majority of you watching anyway. Sorry to be the party pooper, but there are a few big issues that most outlets are omitting in their coverage of this story, either unknowingly or intentionally to make this all sound more spectacular than it actually is. These issues are the normal expectations for staff turnover, the way the data for these headlines were collected, and the other effects of the pandemic that have been conveniently left out of the flashy headlines. So it's time to learn how money works before you join the unemployment bandwagon that may not actually exist. Okay, so the first issue with this supposed phenomenon is that it's not particularly phenomenal. Yes, 4 million people did quit their jobs in April of 2021, but around 3.8 million people quit their jobs in April of 2019. This flashy number is really not anything too far above what we expect from a normal given month. What might be a bigger story is the fact that double the amount of people are quitting their jobs in a given month than they were just a decade ago, despite the overall workforce only growing about 30% in the same period. In plain English, the trend has been that, on average, people are quitting their jobs 75% more frequently than they were a year ago. Now, I find this interesting, but it doesn't make for a great news headline, because if anything, it gives a sense of security to workers everywhere that looking around for a new job is totally okay. The story of millions of people quitting their jobs to go and take advantage of unemployment benefits while they last, that's scary. An article that reads, a slightly above average amount of employees have left their jobs this month, which is online with historic trends, yeah, not so scary. In fact, I have made an entire video on exactly why company loyalty is something that even companies themselves don't care about these days. This figure is even less of a concern when it is understood in the context of the broader job market. In the same month that 4 million people left their jobs, 6 million people started new ones. Almost all of these quitters are just jumping ship to new roles where they will be working alongside millions of totally new hires that were probably left unemployed from early lockdowns. The Great Resignation has a ring to it, but at worst, it should be called the Great Job Hop, and more realistically, it should be called the Great Hiring. Now, there was one really interesting factor at play here that is certainly worth talking about, and that was a recent executive order that called for severe limitations to be placed on non-compete clauses in employment contracts. Non-compete agreements are clauses in employment contracts that forbid the employee from working for another company in the same industry for a set period of time after they finish working there. The idea is that some employees might be privy to sensitive information like legal proceedings, internal R&D, or even something as mundane as business processes. If a scientist is working in a lab to develop a new miracle cure to every illness ever, then the company wouldn't want them going and working for another pharmaceutical company and taking all of the hard-earned research progress with them. That is perfectly reasonable, and that's why non-compete clauses exist in the first place. The problem is when they start to get used on low-level employees as a tool to control staff rather than as a tool to defend intellectual property. There have been instances where fast food workers were forbidden from working in another fast food restaurant under the guise of non-compete agreements. The problem is that obviously, no fast food worker is going to be dealing with any information that could jeopardize their company if it fell into the hands of their competitors. I'm sure that, if they really wanted to, these multinational corporations could figure out what goes into a cheeseburger. But if a worker wants to leave to get a better job at a competing company, their manager can just go, no, you aren't allowed to do that. It's in your contract. This is terrible news because, as I've explored in my video on staff loyalty, switching jobs is the best way to progress one's career. The truly insidious part about this whole system is that most non-compete agreements are extremely hard to enforce. A handful of states refuse to even enforce these contracts, and of those that do, there is a heavy onus on the employer to prove damages caused by a breach of a non-compete agreement. The problem is that minimum wage workers won't always understand this, and they certainly won't have the means to fight it out in court should it ever come to that. So they take it at face value and remain trapped in a job that can underpay them and overwork them. Now, of course, I am not a lawyer. If you have a non-compete agreement in your contract, don't take my word for it before you tell your boss to cram it before moonwalking over to a competitor. But even still, Many people have now been made aware of this by the executive order and are now checking that non-compete again to see if it really is a barrier to jumping ship. Alright. The other serious problem with the idea of the Great Resignation is what these headlines are based off of. This whole thing started when the annual Microsoft Workplace Report was released in late January. This is a report that is created in collaboration with Microsoft and the EDELMAN Data X intelligence firm, which sounds super dystopian. And it is. The report analyzes trillions of data signals across the Microsoft 365 and LinkedIn networks, and then combines those data points with a survey that is conducted amongst 31,000 participants across 31 distinct regional markets. The data is then aggregated, and insights are drawn from certain trends. But the problem with this whole thing is selection bias. The report controls for a lot of variables, and certainly the people constructing this report are far more intelligent than I am. But there are still some issues. The takeaway of 40% of workers could leave their job this year is also based, at least partially, on an anonymous survey question, would you consider leaving your job in the next 12 months? Like, yeah, almost everybody would answer yes to that, right? And that's sort of the point. The rest of the report is filled with practical ways for managers to boost retention, so it's not exactly going to make itself totally redundant by saying, workers aren't going to quit. But please keep on reading to find out how to get them to super not quit. This insight, built on an arguably pretty leading question, has gone through the useful life cycle of media. A small study presents some data to support their work, then between 25 and 40% of workers said that they would consider leaving their jobs, gets turned into 40% of people are about to quit their jobs, which eventually gets turned into the world is about to lose 40% of its workforce, hashtag the Great Resignation. Now, I don't want to sound overly cynical. To be honest, I actually wish this were true. The workforce is overdue for a good shakeup, but you can't let what you want to be true interfere with your judgment of what actually is, even when it comes in the form of a flashy report from two very reputable companies. Anyway, this probably overlooks the biggest issue of all, which is, so what? The early stages of the pandemic saw a massive decrease in the amount of people quitting their jobs, which was to be expected. At this time, the average worker was being bombarded by headlines about how unemployment had spiked to over 15%, and that we may be in for the greatest recession in history. Fortunately, none of that has eventuated. Not yet, at least. And the rollout of vaccines has meant for many people, life has more or less gone back to normal. People might have been truly dissatisfied with their job at this point 12 months ago, but still held on to it because they had no guarantee of finding another job in the turbulent economic conditions of 2020. Security and self-preservation was driving decision-making more than fulfillment and self-advancement. Those same people who were just holding out to ride out the storm are now free to look for other opportunities and are actually being encouraged to with reports of it being the best time to look for a new job in the last decade. An 18-month backlog of workers all looking for a new job at the same time is naturally going to increase the amount of resignation letters being handed out in the short term. When taking this into consideration, resignation numbers are actually below where we would expect them to be on a 12-month rolling average. The number of people quitting their jobs should actually be around 6 million, and even then, the economy would only just be breaking even on the dip from early 2020. So, no. The Great Resignation is nothing to be fearful of. Not unless you are a terrible manager at a horrible company, I guess. If anything, it is an opportunity. If you are not at least trying to stay open to the idea of a new job with a higher salary and benefits, you are really doing yourself a disservice. If you are still not convinced and think that your company will appreciate your loyalty, go and watch my video on why they really don't. And if anything, modern companies want you to keep on moving along as well. If you do end up enjoying that video and you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to keep on learning how money works.